Sorry, yeah, I was. All right, welcome everyone. We're going to give about a minute for people to filter in. Then I'm going to go over some housekeeping things. As you're here, just make sure that your chat is set to everyone. Sometimes it defaults to panelists, and then not everyone can see what you're saying. And once you have that ready, go ahead and share where you're from. Today, we're talking about literacy in Hindi. So if you have a favorite word, share that with us. And then are there any words you've ever struggled to spell with? Some of them kind of stuck with me into adulthood. So add those to the chat, say hi to everyone, and we'll get started in about 40 seconds or so. Maine, New York City, South Korea, wonderful. Oregon, holy moly, lots of people. Madison, Alabama. I'm from Madison, Wisconsin. And Claire's from Alabama, so we got that going. I love the word essential and struggle with spaghetti. Yeah, spaghetti is interesting. I struggle with French-derived words. More from South Korea, wonderful. Huntsville, Alabama. All right, we're gonna go. I struggled with Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania. That's great, Beth. All right, so I'm Chris. Win this day. I like it, Kim. So let's go ahead and get started. A few housekeeping things. If you live in Zoom like some people, these are pretty common. We've got about 40 minutes today, with a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. There's going to be a lot of information in today's presentation, so this will be recorded. So if anything pops up and you're like, wait, what was that? Or you can't wait to share this with your team, don't worry. We're recording it and we'll send it your way once this is done, and you can spend your Friday night with some hot chocolate watching this again. Again, I already said this, make sure your chat is set to everyone so everyone can see what you're saying. If you haven't already, share where you're joining us from. Do you have a favorite word? Is there a word you've always struggled to spell? I really like the word parsimonious. I don't get to use it much, but I like saying it. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature. This will just help us keep track of what those questions are and make sure that we answer them. We have a wonderful mod team in the background that are going to be answering questions while Claire and myself are speaking. So if you use that Q&A, it'll just make sure that we found your question, we saw it, we responded to it. Some we might answer live, but it can get lost in the chat. So make sure you use that. And then giveaway at the end. It's usually the most exciting part, but after seeing Claire's presentation, I think it's my second favorite part. But just being here, you'll be entered to win a free Indie. So stick around for that at the end. All right, so I'm Chris. I'm a content manager here at Sphero. I've been developing curriculum for about 10 years, and before that, I taught kindergarten and 5th grade and was a literacy coach on the south side of Chicago. But enough about me. The star of today is Claire. She's a reading specialist in Alabama, and I could go on about her credentials and her experience. However, I think about 60 seconds or so into her presentation, you'll be like, oh, she knows what she's talking about. So I want to make sure that we get to that as quick as we can. Just a quick intro on Indi. So if you're unfamiliar with what Indi is, it's that little blue robot with the cute little headlights in this picture. It is a robot we typically say for like pre-K through 2nd grade, but I think you'll see today that there are applications for all of them at elementary school, depending on what your objectives are. Indi is really unique in that you can sort of introduce these ideas of computational thinking without a screen. So you don't need an app. You don't need an iOS device or a laptop for your kindergartners. They can get started practicing with Indi without those things. However, we do have an app where you can go in and sort of change things and make Indi sing a song as it goes over different tiles if you want. So Indi works with a I don't know if you can see that with the background. There's a color sensor underneath it. And those tiles you see in this image, each of those tiles, when Indy drives over it, it tells Indy to do something. So green means go, yellow means slow down, red means stop, blue means turn 90 degrees to the right. So those sort of consistent input outputs are helping students learn the basics of programming. So when we think about computational thinking and the 4 pillars, we have decomposition, breaking down large problems into smaller problems. You can set up a path for students to create a program for Indy to follow, and then they break that down into small pieces. So I need Indy to turn left 90 degrees. What do I need to do in order for that to happen? And they might have it memorized. They might go, oh, pink. I put a pink tile there, and then I move on to the next part. Or they might need to do trial and error. They put a teal tile. Oh, that didn't work. They put a purple tile. That was exciting, but it didn't work. So breaking those larger problems down into solvable pieces is a great way for kids to get started. And then cross-curricular integration, bringing Indy into your literacy block or your math block. And Claire's going to show us a billion ideas today of how you can do that with literacy. So with that in mind, I'm going to hand things over to Claire, and she's going to take over.
Thank you. Yes. Okay. So getting started today, I think one of the biggest things that I was really looking for with phonics and teaching it is I love the systematic and explicit instruction of phonics. I think it is so important. But one thing that I found is that when we start talking about this, I think that everyone kind of hits the snooze button in their brain and it starts to feel boring and mundane. So the one thing I really started to look for is how we can keep the fun in reading and how we can keep the fun in phonics. And that's what I really want to share about today. And truly, I'm so humbled to be here. Thank you so much for such a great intro. This really is kind of just seeing all of these ideas come to fruition. And it's an amazing experience for me to see this one little idea I had visiting the Future of Education Technology conference, meeting with Sphero, talking through them, and then kind of seeing it work and play into classrooms and different age groups, and now to be in this experience right here. I am so humbled to be here. But what we are looking on right here. So a little quick intro into me. Again, I am Claire Stewart. I'm a reading specialist at Midtown Elementary School. We are in Madison, Alabama. So I see some of my friends are on here, which is so great. I have a master's in differentiated instruction and a certified reading specialist. I was trained at the associate level from the Orton Gillingham Academy. And truly, my passion is for reading. I love the science of reading. I love how our brain works. I love seeing how it adapts for different students and how we all take a different approach to things, but how it also all evens out to that one central science of reading, how our brains are taking in those words. And so that's what I really love to research. That's what I love to utilize in classrooms. So I'm so thankful for my job and my district that allows me to do all of these things. The first thing I kind of want to talk about is just to establish a little bit about the science of reading, to establish a little bit about how far reading has come just over the last few years. So I think we probably have a wide array of ages and people who learned at different points, taught at different points, all of those different things. And it's funny when you get a group together of so many different age groups to see how we all learned how to read, because it's so different. I know that when I was brought up, it was very much kind of you give a book to them. If you expose them to enough literature, they'll learn how to read on their own. And so that kind of was an idea that persisted for so long. And it really came about because the idea that the English language is just too crazy. So many of the rules are unpredictable. There are too many rule breakers. You can't possibly memorize every single rule. So why even bother teaching them? And so it also came from this idea of a study that was done. And essentially, they looked at fluent and proficient readers to see what they were doing. And what they noticed is that these kids would have a book in front of them, and they were reading so quickly and so rapidly that the thought was made that they were bypassing phonics altogether, and they were using context clues. They were looking at the first letter, and they were guessing their words, because how else would you be able to read a word so quickly? So that's where a lot of instruction came into utilizing context clues, reading everything else around it, guessing a word, looking at that first letter. But we also noticed is that a lot of students were still struggling with this. Of course, some kids were able to get it and they were able to master it, but the larger population, the larger majority of students were struggling with this. When they got to really long and complex words, they had no skills to break it down. And if you haven't been exposed to that word before, you have no idea the realm to guess it. And so What we know about looking at the English language as well is that approximately 96% of the words in our language can be accessed through explicit instruction into the phonics of it, to the phonological awareness, to those rules that we're following with those words. And when we introduce those rules at a systematic and explicit pace with our students year by year, they can begin to learn and acquire all of these different skills and apply them together in their reading. So another piece to look at is just looking at the research about reading. So what we can see here is, of course, there was that idea of looking at students, seeing them reading a book, and they thought they were just guessing a word. But then along the same time as well, they started doing eye movement studies, which my husband is an optometrist, a little bit of background there. So it's very fun in our household when I get talking about eye movement studies because I apply what I know about reading and he applies what he knows about optometry. And we just have great fun debates on everything that goes into it. But these eye movement studies looked at how their eyes were tracking words. And what they found is that mature proficient readers were not skipping words or using context to process them. In fact, their eyes were tracking every single letter in print. And that means that in their brain, they were then taking all of those letters and applying that sound knowledge of what they were making. But we do it at such a rapid rate that it seems like we're guessing. But really, our brain is just working double time. And we're going to talk more about why our brain can work double time with certain words and why it takes a little bit longer for other words in just a little bit. But what we also know is that there's something called orthographic mapping, and this is what happens in our brain. It's that mental process that we use to store those words for immediate and effortless retrieval. So basically what that means is you take a letter, your brain is matching it to a sound that corresponds with that, and it's applying it to a word. And however many times you map that word, it then becomes added basically into your filing cabinet in your brain. So all of those separate pieces are adding up, and let's say that you're exposed to a word multiple times. You'll add that into your filing bank, and it allows you to recall that word much quicker when you've been exposed to it multiple times. And this research comes from letters, which is another one of those pieces that I went through, and I think that's kind of viewed as like the gold standard of reading instruction now in the science of reading, which if you haven't gone through letters training, our district and state has been great to provide that as a free resource for our teachers to go through. But that is so much of where so much of the background comes in, and honestly is what fueled my passion for reading. Okay, so right here, I'm going to do a little experiment, and I'm sorry, I love to do this with adults. I love to do this with people that I'm working with, especially our teachers. The biggest thing right here is I'm going to get you all to try your hardest not to read these words. And that seems kind of counterintuitive, but we're going to talk a little bit about it. But so I'm going to flash on words, and what I want you to do is you're trying not to read them. Okay? Now, as you can see with this word right here, it's a little bit longer, but could you stop your brain from reading it? Most people can't. So even though it's a longer word, even though you're actively trying not to read it, your brain has mapped this word so many times that you read it without any effort at all. Even when we get to a harder word, we've encountered this word many times. We've seen it in our kitchen every day. So we have multiple exposures to this word. So our brain, even though it's longer, even though it has so many syllables in there, our brain still reads it so effortlessly. Okay, but here's a little bit more complicated of a word. Now, this is kind of, I wouldn't say it's a special word, but it's a word that means a little bit more here. If you have kids who have suffered from ear infections, this word might be very common to you. This is a popular antibiotic. Both of my boys have frequent ear infections as kids and have tubes in their ears. So we were prescribed Ceftonir so many times, and reading it on, talking it with the doctor, reading it on the labels, reading the dosage, talking about it with my husband, everything of the sort. This word is now unfortunately logged into my memory. No matter how many times I forget it, how many times I try not to read it, this word sticks out of my brain because I've had so many exposures to it. Here's an even more complicated word. So this is actually a type of vitamin that you take. I think it's vitamin D actually, but I have used this word multiple times in multiple presentations, and I still struggle with how to say it, but I'm fairly certain it's ergocalciferol. It's the last part that always throws me off. But this is kind of my perfect example as well, because when we first look at this word, I think we all started reading about it and we break it apart into those little syllables, go, cal, and so on. So we all started breaking it apart into that. But then we come to this area at the end, the all part, and that becomes a little bit more complicated. Now, when I first read this word without any exposure of how to say it, I had to look it up on Google and how to pronounce it correctly. I continuously would call it ergocalciferol. And so because I have mapped that in my brain, I still look at it and I say it wrong at first, and then I have to think about it a little bit. And I love that because that's exactly what our students are doing. And that's why this whole presentation, working with Indy, all of these pieces, it's why I'm so passionate about it, because I think we all have those words. And of course, we touched on it a little bit at the intro of words that we have struggled to spell or words that we have struggled to say. I don't know how many times I have read the word dachshund in a book, but my brain will still automatically call that little dog a dachshund, because when I was in the 4th grade, I read it in a book without any context, and I assigned my own meaning to it, and I assigned my own sounds to it. And so my brain still is rerouting, trying to figure it out again. And so that's what we hope as teachers to help prevent our students from. And that's where systematic and explicit phonics comes into play, because if we teach our students to read it correctly on multiple exposures, then we can make sure that they map that word correctly in their brain and they are not 32-year-olds still reading dachshund. Of course, I had great teachers. It's nothing against them, but of course I did it myself. But let's first look at our steps to mapping a word. So this is called phoneme-grapheme mapping, and this is where we're really starting out with Indy. Now, we're going to go into how we use Indy for phoneme-grapheme mapping, but let me establish a little background first. So phoneme-grapheme mapping is how you force your brain into that orthographic mapping pattern. Now, some students, when they look at a word, their brain automatically does this. However, for a large number of our students, they don't naturally start using this. So the first step when you're phoneme-grapheme mapping is to segment the word into phonemes, and you can do finger taps, you can use Play-Doh, anything like that to help map out those sounds. Then you say the sounds while touching your word. So let's take the word got. If we were to segment that word into phonemes, g, ah, t. I've assigned the sound to each part of it. Now I take the sounds when I'm writing it on the paper and I write the corresponding letters. G comes from G, ah, O, t, T. Then I check the letters and the sounds by tapping the tiles. G, ah, t. Blend it together. Got. Say the word. Got. And then I write the word correctly on the line without the support of the mapping boxes. Phoneme-grapheme mapping is taking the phoneme sounds, attaching it to the grapheme of the letters, and mapping it out on the paper. Now, these little boxes also come into play because it helps our brain to segment that sound into that specific letter. So when we see the letter G, we know it makes the G sound. But this type of orthographic mapping requires both hearing, seeing, and writing the words. And that is exactly what phoneme-grapheme mapping allows us to do. This may look kind of familiar to you. I think this sheet is readily available on the internet, but it just kind of breaks everything down. You tap it down, you map out by putting a chip or a box in there, you graph it with the letters, blend it together on the line, say the word fast, and then you write it on the page. This is kind of our most simple form of phoneme-grapheme mapping and something that is so easy to integrate into the classroom. Now, of course, anything we do in the classroom, I think the most common complaint about anything during the day of teaching is that there's never enough time. So the most important thing is always to make sure that whatever strategies we are using, we are getting the most bang for our educational buck. And so that is what we look at with phoneme-grapheme mapping as well. So research tells us about phoneme-grapheme mapping that the programs that are utilizing this phonemic awareness and alphabetic code outperform students who do not receive this type of instruction of integrated standard spelling. So that's what we're looking at. We know that the students are outperforming other students when they use this type of instruction. But how can we integrate it into the classroom? And how can we make it fun for our students? Because I don't know if you guys have experienced it. COVID, I think, has caused a lot of our attention spans to significantly go down. Even I find myself tuning out in some meetings when you're listening to things for a long time. And it's just hard to get our kids to pay attention. But of course, we have things that we can use on our end. We have instructional practices that we can use to help keep their motivation up, to help keep their attention spans and help keep them engaged in our lesson. And that's really what I love about Indy and what I love about working with robots and reading is that we can keep it fun while we're also teaching these very important elements. So why is this important as well? And I think one of the biggest things we're seeing, especially in America, and what we're looking at is the prevalence of dyslexia. So we kind of have increased our understanding. We've increased our research. So we have so much more understanding of dyslexia, but this is also brought about to identifying so many students who have this need. And with dyslexia, one of the most important things that I kind of think also is the link of STEM and reading is we look at the people with dyslexia. So first of all, the International Dyslexia Association says that about 13 to 14% of students have a handicapping condition of dyslexia. So that's one thing that I think is also important when we're thinking about dyslexia, is realizing that a lot of times it's a spectrum of things. So that means that you may have a few characteristics that make it difficult for you to read, but some students have that handicapping condition. But up to 15 to 20% of the population have dyslexia symptoms. So that means within this room, 50 to 20% of us may have those dyslexia symptoms, but we may have overcome them through instruction. And the important thing is to remember that 95% of our students can learn how to read with explicit and systematic phonics instruction. But let's look at the workforce. So according to the Cass Business School in London, they found that 35% of entrepreneurs identify themselves as dyslexic, and then about 20 to 30% of engineers identify themselves as dyslexic. I found that to be very interesting because when you think about STEM and when you think about that in the workforce, when you think about that in the classroom, we naturally see that students with dyslexia, they think in pictures and shapes and through movement. They have greater pattern recognition and they have better spatial awareness. So naturally, their brains are working at a rate and an area to support coding, to support the use of engineering in the workforce, of entrepreneurship, of all of these things. Their brain is naturally working to support them there. So why would we not use something that is a positive, a strength for them in this spatial thinking, in this pattern work, to help them increase their reading ability? And that's what I really want to do today, is to kind of change how you're thinking about it and change how you're approaching instruction and maybe integrate a little bit more STEM into the classroom. Now, just establishing, of course, in the intro, they did a great job of establishing this, but this is the most basic thing that you can do with Indi. So green means go, yellow means slow down, red means stop. So when I first started thinking about it, I hope you guys thought when you saw the little letter tiles that your brain associated it with the tiles that go with phoneme-grapheme mapping, because that's what my brain did. And I thought, well, what if we use those tiles that we're using in phoneme-grapheme mapping to represent a color? And so, of course, first, green, we've got to get Indi going. And so I thought to myself, well, we're going to speed through these letters. So I need to think of a letter that generally is not a rule breaker, that follows most of the rules, that we can kind of know consistently it will make its traditional sound. And of course, if you ask any kindergarten or first grade classroom, they will immediately tell you that consonants are not usually the rule breakers. When you see a P, it will say P, or when you see an L, it will say O most often. So when we hear that consonant sound at the beginning of the word, we can use that yellow, and that gets our word going. But then we have a yellow, which makes us slow down. It makes us think a little bit more. So of course, asking a kindergarten or first grade classroom, which letters are our rule breakers? And they will immediately tell you a vowel. Because of the vowels, we know that there are 5 to 6 vowels and over 20 sounds that they can make. So that is a lot of combinations. We know that A can say a, or it can say a, or it can say It can be a whole gamut of sounds that it can make. So we have to stop and we have to think about that. So then finally we end with red, and red causes Indi to stop. So we know that whatever letter it is then there, it needs to stop our word. So that also is our consonants. When you look at an open and closed syllable, in a closed syllable, we're going to have the short vowel sound like bed, met, dad. But if you have no red on the end, we have that open sound like hi, he, and you're going to see how this comes into play next. But that's our most basic rules for Indi: green, yellow, red. And that is where I love to start off with any group. So looking right here, we are just looking at a closed syllable word. So we've got the word met right here. We started off with our green over here. It's a common letter sound to begin our word. And then we assigned a yellow because we heard that vowel sound. And then we have our stop sound at the end, the T. And we know that anytime a word ends in that stop sound, anytime it ends in a consonant, that vowel is short in a closed syllable word. So right here is our closed syllable word. I love starting off with a closed syllable word with students because it's so basic: green, yellow, red, tap it out, write it, sound it. But then my next thing that I love to do is I give them an open syllable word. So take the T off of met, and now we're tapping it out and we're looking at this. So we've got E. And so we've got our common letter sound here with the green, but then we've got our vowel. And this word ends in a vowel. So vowels can make that continuous sound as you're pushing them out. But what also happens is that when Indy goes across this green and goes to the yellow, she continues going down. Of course, she does stop eventually, but it's very dramatic for the students when she continues going. So that tells them this is an open syllable because she doesn't stop. She keeps going past this word. Now, vowels, I love working with them in this way as well, because you can talk about how a vowel can be drawn out, especially when it's that long vowel sound, ma-e. Something that I learned in a presentation was to tell them that vowels love to go bungee jumping. And so that's kind of what we did with Indy. She went bungee jumping off of the edge of E and she continued on. But of course, if she's got that consonant right there, that consonant prevents her from going bungee jumping and she stops right there. Those are just kind of some good visuals, especially in kindergarten and first grade when you're working on those open and closed syllables to get them to physically see this is open and this is closed. And then they can apply their knowledge of open and closed syllables to short vowel sounds or long vowel sounds. Now, these are the steps. So we're going to go back through phoneme-grapheme mapping and we're going to relate it back to Indy. So of course, we are segmenting the word into phonemes or sounds using the color tiles. So say the word, they break it down into the sounds, tap it out, and they assign a tile to each one of those sounds. Then they say the sounds while touching each tile to ensure every sound is represented. And then they take the sounds and they write the corresponding letter on each tile or under each tile or on their paper on the phoneme-grapheme recording page. Now, one tip I have, and you'll see a picture of this a little bit later, is for kindergarten and first grade when they're struggling a little bit more with their letter formation, using magnetic letter tiles and placing them under the corresponding tiles can be a great support for those students as they're working through that. You'll see a picture of it a little bit later, but I found that to be a great support when they are working with that letter formation and struggling a little bit with that. And then finally, after you've gone through all of that, you let Indy go over the words. You say the sound or over the tiles. You say the sounds as she goes over it, and then they blend it back together in the word and they write it on their page. And what I love about it is because Indy is traveling over the top, it keeps them engaged because they see her moving. They have to make the sounds as she's going over it because she's not stopping for them. And it then gives them an endpoint to write that word out there and check it to make sure it's correct. So this is a great phoneme-grapheme page right here. This is great in K3. Most often I use it in kindergarten and first grade because of the simple format of it. The letters, you can put your letters in here within these boxes. They can color code the boxes if that's helpful, and then they write the words right here. You can see right here, this is actually a kindergarten group of kids, and they were working on open and closed syllables, and then they were writing it on their paper. So as you can see, they've all got their fingers out. They're all tracking those sounds with the words there, and they're all following Indy together. But now let's take it a little bit deeper. So what I love about this and utilizing this with phonics instruction is that you can combine it with almost any rule, any skill. So right here, we were working on digraphs. So digraphs are two letters that are put together to make one sound. So of course, they started it off, common letter sound in the P. We had the A there, vowels are short in a closed syllable word. We had a red at the end. They knew that this would be a short A. But then we've got this digraph right here. And of course, we know that we have to remember, I don't know how many of you guys, if you've experienced this when you're writing the word pack and your kids will put a K at the end or a C at the end. But I needed something to help them remember that this is a CK. So one of the great rhymes that I learned through my Orton Gillingham training was that long spelling right after short vowel. So because my kids knew that this red right here was going to cause that closed syllable, it had to be a short vowel sound, they had to use a CK right here. And so that long spelling right after short vowel helps to prompt their brain, helps them to remember what to put there. And because it's only one tile, they remember that these two letters are only making one sound. So we put our digraph in that box. Now, the next piece we looked at was blends. And so looking right here, we have our F and L blend right here. Now, what I love about Indy is that when Indy starts on green and then she passes over another green, she actually speeds up. She goes faster, which is exactly what we want our students to do with a blend. They're not making one sound together. They are two sounds, but they're two sounds blended together. So when they're looking through here, Indy will go over and she'll speed up over that L, which prompts them to blend that sound together a little bit more. We've got our yellow here for our vowel, and then we've got our P. And this is just kind of a little side note that I love to show the different ways that you can expand the idea of this. One thing that you can go into, especially if you work in a speech capacity, is talking about stops and continuance within letters. So one thing you could do is have red represented by stop sounds like P, which a stop sound would be any letter that when you say that sound, you push out the breath and it stops. Like with P, you say P. But then a continuant would be any letter in which you say the sound and it continues on, like S. And you can continue that sound until you choose to stop your breath. So red would be a great way to show our stop letters. Yellow would be a great way to show our continuant letters, especially if you're working on speech, how to pronounce those different pieces together. Now we're getting a little bit more complex, but that's what I love, because I think it's important that when we're working with phonics, and especially when we're working with something exciting, that we're working on hard things, because when we're working through these hard concepts, that's when we need their most attention. That's when we need them most engaged, because you're working on difficult pieces. So with this word down, we were working in this class on OW and OU. Now, traditionally, OU is found in the middle of the word and OW is found at the end of a word. So we've got our green to represent that, our yellow for our vowel, but then we know that OU is in the middle of the word, OW is at the end of the word, unless there is an N or an L at the end. Now, this purple tile right here causes so much fun and commotion in classes, and I truly love it because on the purple, Indy does her party, and it's where she plays music, she dances around, she goes in a circle. It's really fun for kids to see. So I love using purple in the classroom when you are working on something that we really need to stop and think about. So on the word down, we broke apart that word, duh, ow, and then when they heard that N or that L sound, they immediately took out a purple tile and they put it down. Now, as Indy travels over their words, it prompts their brain to stop and think. There's something different about this word, and they can remember the rule of when it ends in an N or an L, we use an OW in the middle of the word. And that's really what we want them to do. We want them to stop and think and look at how that word is mapped, because we know that if they map that word correctly multiple times, it will then be added into their brain's filing cabinet that they can immediately recall later. And so that's what's important, to build this mapping for them. And for every student, their number of times that they need to map a word is different. That's why we'll see some kids who can read a word 3 times, immediately log it into their memory. But we'll see some kids who need 30, 40, 50 exposures to a word before it's added to their memory for automatic retrieval. And this is just another piece that helps them for that to really stick out in their memory, to really log in their brain, so that we get the most bang for our buck when we're teaching these words. Now, this next piece, I'm going to kind of show you guys what it looks like in our classroom. So we've got right here where they were writing down our words, and I'm going to play this video. I hope it works for everyone, but if it doesn't, don't worry. I'll explain what's happening in it afterwards. So Indy celebrated right here. So what does it mean you used to spell this right here? OW or OU? W. OW, because what normally goes in the middle of the word? What? OU goes in the middle of the word. Yes, with an L or an N. Perfect. So here's what we learned with purple was that anytime it's celebrated, they know that they needed an OW right before. And that is what that student was confirming back to me, was because there was an L or an N, they used the OW right there. And this just shows again how kids will kind of figure things out. If you see their tiles are all right next to each other, this group started by spacing out all their tiles, and they realized that Indy would kind of get off a little bit. So they started putting their tiles close together. And it's just kind of fun to see them thinking about it in a different way, problem solving together. Sorry. Okay. Now, here's where we get a little bit more complex. So this piece, we were actually teaching 2 different things. So the first thing we talked about is I was talking with the teacher, and they were having trouble teaching UR, IR, and ER. Now, the trouble with UR, IR, and ER are that there are some rules, but it is not always a consistent rule that it's following. So one thing that I learned through my OG training was the use of UR, IR, and ER. Most common ER at the end of the word is for suffixes. So we know if we hear that sound at the end of the word, it's most often coming from ER. But then you've got your UR and IR. So IR can often be assigned to clothes like shirt or skirt, or numbers like 3rd, 13, or 1st. And then UR comes from hurt words like nurse, hurt, burn, If you blurt out, you may hurt someone's feelings. If you go over the curb, you may hurt your car. All of these little things are just kind of tricks that can help your kids remember those. So that's where we started out. We wanted to kind of learn more about the ER, IR, UR usage. But then we started with the word nurse. And so one thing that we noticed at the end is that we've got an S here, but we've also got an E at the end of the word. So this E is one of the millions of jobs of sneaky E, super E, magic E, all of those things. Another job that E can do is our placeholder E. So in English, words that end in S are usually and need to be plural. But nurse is not plural. It's one nurse. So what E does is it serves as a placeholder to end our word because it can't end in an S. So one thing that we worked out is because this was a placeholder E, we needed to do something to signify that there was another letter. This E wasn't really going to interfere with any other letters. It was just kind of standing there, but we needed a way to help us remember it. So we added in our blue tile, and this caused Indy to turn. Now, what we wanted to do is we aligned our purple tile a little bit next to the blue tile, so it looked like it was still one sound, even though it's two different colors. And we put that purple tile there because that purple tile is that celebration tile. It's our moment to pause and think something is different in this word. So that was where they paused, they thought, and they remembered there's a placeholder E on the word nurse. And so again, it's just that moment of adding in that little bit of extra piece to help their brain remember it, help their brain map it, and use it again. And because that celebration piece is so fun, they just get a good laugh about it. And it's a great way to remember that part. Now, this is the next part. We're going a little bit more in depth here. So this came about with a schwa. And if you have found schwas to be easy to teach in your classroom, please send me all of your tips because I have always found it to be the most difficult thing to teach. Not impossible, just difficult. Because a schwa is, of course, that lazy sound, but can also kind of have variant sounds that it makes. It can come from almost every single vowel. It's one of those confusing pieces. Is it a U? Is it an A? What letter is making that? And so what I really wanted them to do is we focus first on schwas at the beginning of a word. And I just wanted to them to identify that in the word about, the sound was not coming from a U at the beginning of about. And we did this with around, along, all of these different pieces. So we started with our green because you have to have a green tile to begin. So of course they wanted it to look like one sound. So you can see here where they've kind of rigged it a little bit to be the green and the orange. And I provided them the orange tile because orange caused us to make that little diagonal turn. And what we said was when she made that little diagonal turn was that schwas can turn us around, but we have to keep reading. So afterwards, I gave them the teal tile to put right here, and they had to figure out where to place the teal tile and then where to place their other tiles to get them rerouted back to their word. So what they did is they would use the green and the orange for any schwa sounds they found, and then they added in their teal, which stands for that, which represents that B. But then, of course, we have our vowel for that OU and our ending sound of T. So as you can see here, Indy is tracking along there. They are using their fingers to track the words as well. But that was just kind of to help them realize that there's a different sound here. There's something that we need to pay attention to and just to map it in their brain because ultimately, schwas are hard to teach at any grade that you're looking at. Even as adults, I've worked with multiple teachers who still need many lessons in schwas. And truthfully, so do I sometimes. I Google a lot of things when I'm working with teachers and students to figure things out. And schwas is probably in the top 10% of things that I look up and learning about the rules of that. But what I loved about this is that we took a difficult concept, something that was really hard to teach, something that our kids were really struggling with, and we made it fun. So it stuck out to them so they remembered it for later. And I really think that's what it's all about. It's just making things fun and making those difficult pieces seem like something exciting. Now, the thing about Indy and what's great about all of these color tiles, everything you're working with, is how much flexibility you have to change things up. Of course, we have green for consonants, yellow for vowels, but there are so many other colors that you can integrate as well, and you can apply it to almost every single phonics skill. Truthfully, I included these because I had the best pictures of them, but you can apply it into any concept that you are learning, and that's what I love about it. You can change it and you can make it your own, but ultimately, your kids can change it too, and they can make it their own. And that's what makes it really fun. Now, this is another piece that we looked at working with a group on fluency. Again, just how easily Indy can work into your reading block. So looking right here, we were working through a fluency passage. And with this group, what we were really working on was chunking our text, which if you have worked with any students on fluency, you know that the biggest struggle is getting them to realize that reading fluently is not reading really, really, really fast. It is reading at a rate that supports comprehension. So one of the biggest things and one of the hardest things about working with students in fluency is recognizing that you are allowed to breathe while you're reading. But for so many students, they will only breathe when it's absolutely necessary. And then it chops up their reading. It makes it harder for them to understand what they're reading, and it makes it harder for them to remember what's happening. So what we did first is we took our passage and we chunked our text. They scooped those little words together. They grouped together 2 to 3 words within there, and we wrote them on sentence strips. And so we took all of those pieces. So in the spring, it rains a lot. Right here, we had a comma right after spring. So they know that any comma, we use a yellow tile, because a comma is the author telling us, take a breath. And so that's what they knew immediately. So they added in that comma. And then we got over here, the spring rain helps new plants to grow. Ends with that red. Now this bottom line is my favorite line, and why I included this picture, because my students were looking at this word, it helps the grass turn green. They were looking at that sentence, and she gets right here to the grass and she lets out a huge sigh and she says, I need Indy to slow down, because what was happening is every time that Indy crosses over every time Indy crosses over a green tile, she speeds up. So in this word, Indy kept speeding up, going continuously over this, and she was getting exhausted. She was like, I can't keep up with her. She's going too fast. I can't keep up. And I was like, well, what do you need from her? She was like, I need to take a breath. And so I said, well, what color could we use to help us take a breath? And she was like, yellow. And it was the first moment in working with the student and working with her group that they had ever paused to take a breath. And it was that moment where she realized that she was allowed to breathe while she was reading. And in fact, when she would put in where she needed to take breaths, it would help her to pace out her reading more, which was ultimately what we were working on. Not sounding like a robot while we were reading, not reading too quickly, but reading at a rate that supports comprehension. So that was kind of the greatest moment of when we were working on fluency, was just recognizing you're allowed to breathe and you get to pick when you get to do it. This video right here, I hope that everyone can view it, but I'll talk about it as well. We have our final sentence that we are reading together. And this is when the last sentence of the story ended in an exclamation point. So you know we had to use a purple tile for celebration. So I didn't tell them anything about what the purple tile was doing. Of course, they had many, many questions that they wanted to know. But what I love about this is that their excitement and their reaction is truly so pure, because it was a surprise to them. They had no idea. Read it.
So be thankful for spring rain.
And so what I loved about that, of course, we're ending in the exclamation point, but it really was that moment where they got to celebrate what they were reading, and it ended that story. And it really helped them to realize that when there's an exclamation point, you are excited about what you're reading. And it really prompted them to pay attention to punctuation from then on out, because they would get very excited every time there was a question mark or an exclamation point, not so excited for a period, but that's to be expected. The next
Read it.
There. Okay, so the next thing I kind of want to talk about is just learning coding with Indy. So one of the first things that I started doing as well, aside from phonics, was just teaching them about how coding works and how these tiles work. So what I did was I took the story of the very hungry caterpillar. And we, of course, put a little caterpillar on Indy because she deserved to participate. And then we just took the food items in there. And so what we did was we read the story together as a class, and we used it for sequencing of events. So what I loved about this part of introducing all of these colors is that it was just in play. And I think we all know in education, especially with our classrooms, that anytime you're introducing a new learning tool, you have to allow your kids to play with it. I think about all the math manipulatives that we use, all of the reading pieces that we use, the witchy fingers, everything like that. We all start by letting them play with them, because that's our natural, what we want to do. We want to play. We want to have fun with these items first. And so this was a great way to play, but in a structured and supported way for them to make trial and error, and where I could assist them with all of their trials and all of their errors. So what we did was we had our little caterpillar, and then we would go through the story, sequencing the events of every food item that she ate. So we started first right here with that little apple, and they got to pick their color, whatever color. So that meant that of all of my groups, every single group's path and maze ended up different. But as soon as she started on there, they then had to think about which way Indy was going. And then when they put down another color, she was going in a different direction. So you can see her path here. She goes this way, then she crosses to the blue, and then she goes over here to the green. And so that was helping them to realize where she was going. So we would stop after each one. They would log where Indy was and then figure out where they needed to put their next tile. And then we would introduce our next food item. So we did this one by one. And how this helped me was that anytime a group was struggling with where to put it next, I could intervene very quickly. I could ask some questions to help lead them to the correct placement. And then I could kind of just support them in finding the different ways that she could go. It was just a fun way to explore all of the different color tiles to see what everything did before we started using them and just practice placement, because there are certain things like Indy has a slight little turn to her. And so they would realize, okay, I need to put my tile very close so that she goes directly over this tile. Or however you place Indy on a tile is how she's going to go. So the first few times a couple kids would put her on there backwards and then be so surprised when she went nowhere near their path. So it's just a great way to kind of learn and explore with them and also support them in that manner. And this you can see right here is kind of one of our finished things. Looking back and forth between the two, we have one that's a little bit more complex, one that's a little bit shorter right here. But it's all in what they wanted to do. It's all in how they wanted to use it. And that's what I love. They had the ability to kind of play around with it and make it their own. And then of course, when we ended with our red and it all ended, I passed out a purple to every single group and they got to see Indy cross over and celebrate as she became a butterfly. So it was really just a fun moment to help teach them about all of those things. But that is truly one of the things that I really love about Indy is how much you can use her to work in your classroom, how you can change what you're doing, and how you can just make learning so fun. And I'm going to pass it back over to you, Chris.
I started talking without unmuting myself. All right. Thanks so much, Claire. I wasn't joking when I said there's going to be a ton of really great information that you can use in your classroom. Just one thing here. So if you either have an Indy and you're like, what should I do with it? Or you're like, I don't have an Indy, what could I do with it? Brad put this link in the chat. We've got a lot of free activities. You can use this QR code or click the link in the chat. But we have a standards aligned educator guide. We've got math and literacy and special education guides. We've got do-it-yourself challenge cards and a lot more. So go ahead and check out that if you're interested in more content. And then we have a sneak peek of something that's coming in 2024. If you're familiar with Bolt, Bolt has some code mats that go with it, where there's a grid and a theme, like a space theme. And we're looking to do the same with Indy. And there were a few questions in the chat about like, where do you put the words or the letters? This grid is one way that you could do that. So you can have the tiles underneath and then like your words that you want for sentence construction or even word construction. So you have a C, an A, a T. You program Indy underneath that. The students can say the sounds k, a, t, as Indy drives across and then say the word. So there's a lot of sort of ideas that we could do here. And then on the right side, it's just a little snippet of what it might look like. We're kind of going through different iterations and testing right now. But the idea is on the other side, we have a theme. And within that theme, there are links to different literacy skills that you'll be doing in your classroom, like the retelling roller coaster here. So you program Indy to go there. You retell the story. Maybe you talk about the beginning, the middle, the end. Maybe you summarize that story. So I just wanted to give a sneak peek of what that looks like. And it's coming in 2024. So we're very excited about that. We answered a bunch of questions in the chat. So I think we've got everything down there. And I know that we're kind of at time, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time. However, the most important part, we have our person selected, and Katrina Maddock, you are the winner of our free Indy today. We will reach out to you to make sure that you get that. We'll get your information and send it your way. And then, of course, if you're doing some great things in your classroom, we love to see that too. I'm on the content team, so I'm making stuff for y'all to use with our robots, but we love seeing what teachers are doing, especially teachers like Claire, who are really going above and beyond and creating some great stuff for their classroom. So if you have any further questions for us, please email us, education@sphero.com. Follow us on all the socials, Twitter/X, Instagram, Facebook, and everything. But thanks everyone for coming. Congratulations, Katrina. And thanks so much, Claire, for sharing your wealth of knowledge and everything you did today. So thanks everyone. We hope to see you next time. Bye, y'all.